Sometimes survival forces us into places we never imagined we'd go, and sometimes those places hold secrets that change everything. When the worst blizzard in decades swept across the Dakota plains, Sarah Mitchell thought she was lucky to find shelter. What she discovered inside that abandoned shack would haunt her forever and spark a rescue mission that would test the limits of human compassion. This is the true story of how a woman's fight for survival led to saving a life that everyone else had given up on. Sarah Mitchell gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the thick snow that seemed to come from every direction at once. She had been driving for 3 hours on what should have been a simple 2-hour trip from Bismarck to visit her elderly aunt in the small town of Williston, North Dakota. Now she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of her car. The weather forecast had called for light snow, nothing more than a dusting. But the storm that hit the Dakota plains that February evening was unlike anything the region had seen in decades. Winds howled at 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made driving nearly impossible. Sarah had considered turning back twice, but she was already more than halfway to her destination, and her aunt was expecting her. Margaret Turner, her 78-year-old aunt, lived alone in a farmhouse outside Williston. She had called Sarah 3 days earlier, sounding lonely and asking if she could visit for the weekend. Sarah's aunt had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. The woman had been like a mother to her, and Sarah couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her. As the storm intensified, Sarah realized she had made a terrible mistake. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts warning people to stay off the roads. The National Weather Service had upgraded the storm to a blizzard warning, with forecasters predicting up to 3 feet of snow and dangerous wind chills that could reach 40 below zero. Several vehicles had already been abandoned along the highways, and rescue crews were having difficulty reaching stranded motorists. Sarah's Honda Civic was not built for this kind of weather. Despite having winter tires, the car slipped and slid on the increasingly treacherous road. The heating system struggled to keep up with the bitter cold seeping through the windows, and ice was beginning to form on the inside of the windshield. She cranked up the defroster and tried to stay calm, but panic was starting to set in. Her cell phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. The gas gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining, and she had no idea how much farther she had to go. The road signs were completely obscured by snow, and several times she wasn't even sure she was still on the highway. The white landscape had swallowed all familiar landmarks. The wind rocked her small car violently from side to side. At one point, a particularly strong gust pushed the Honda so hard that Sarah felt 2 wheels lift off the ground momentarily. She reduced her speed to a crawl, afraid that going any faster would send her careening off the road into a ditch or worse. Other drivers had apparently made the same decision, as she occasionally glimpsed the taillights of vehicles ahead moving at the same snail's pace. As the hours passed, Sarah noticed that even those few other vehicles seemed to be disappearing from the road. The smart ones had probably found places to wait out the storm, while others might have become stuck or decided to abandon their cars altogether. She began to feel completely alone in the vast white wilderness that surrounded her. The temperature gauge on her dashboard showed the engine was running hot, probably from working so hard in the extreme conditions. Sarah knew that if the engine overheated, she would be stranded with no heat and no way to call for help. The thought terrified her. She had heard stories of people freezing to death in their cars during blizzards, and she didn't want to become another tragic statistic. When she finally saw the dim outline of a building through the swirling snow, Sarah felt a surge of relief. It looked like an old farm structure, probably a barn or equipment shed, set back about 50 yards from the road. Without hesitation, she turned off the highway and drove as close to the building as possible. The car immediately got stuck in a snowdrift, but Sarah didn't care. She just needed to get out of the wind and cold. Grabbing her purse, a bottle of water, and a small emergency kit from the trunk, Sarah bundled herself up in her winter coat and pushed open the car door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her over. The cold was so intense it felt like knives cutting through her clothes. She had never experienced anything like it. The snow stung her face like tiny bullets, and within seconds her exposed skin began to burn from the cold. Fighting against the wind, Sarah struggled through knee-deep snow toward the building. Each step was exhausting, and the wind kept trying to push her off course. Several times she stumbled and almost fell, but somehow she managed to keep moving forward. The snow was so thick she could barely see the structure she was heading toward, even though it was only yards away. When she finally reached the building, Sarah discovered it wasn't a barn at all, but an old wooden shack that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, Several boards were missing from the siding, and the roof appeared to sag in places, but it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. She just hoped the door wasn't locked. Sarah fumbled with the handle, her fingers already numb from the cold despite her gloves. The door was stuck, probably from years of disuse and the swelling caused by moisture. She threw her weight against it and pushed hard. After several attempts, the door suddenly gave way, sending her tumbling into the dark interior of the shack. The relief of being out of the wind was immediate, even though the interior wasn't much warmer than outside. At least the walls blocked the brutal wind, and she was no longer being pelted by snow. Sarah used the flashlight from her emergency kit to look around the small space. The shack was obviously abandoned, filled with old farming equipment, rusted tools, and piles of rotting wood. Spiderwebs hung from the rafters, and the floor was covered with years of accumulated dirt and debris. But something else caught her attention immediately. The air inside the shack had a strange smell, something she couldn't quite identify at first. It wasn't just the mustiness of an old building or the smell of decay. There was something else, something that made her stomach turn. As she moved the flashlight beam around the room, Sarah tried to locate the source of the odor. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it over the howling of the wind outside. It was like a whimper or a moan, barely audible but definitely human. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized she might not be alone in the shack. Someone or something else was in there with her. Slowly, she moved the flashlight beam toward the back corner of the shack where the sound seemed to be coming from. What she saw there would be burned into her memory forever. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure of a man. But this wasn't just someone else who had taken shelter from the storm. This man was chained to the wall. Sarah's hand shook as she held the flashlight steady, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The man appeared to be Native American, probably in his 30s, with long black hair that was matted and dirty. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and heavy chains secured his wrists and ankles to metal rings that had been bolted into the wooden planks. His clothes were torn and filthy, and even from across the room Sarah could see dark stains that looked like blood. The man's head was hanging down and his breathing was labored and shallow. He looked like he had been there for a long time, possibly days or even weeks. The smell she had noticed earlier suddenly made horrible sense. It was the smell of human suffering, of someone who had been held captive in this terrible place without proper food, water, or sanitation. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. Had she stumbled upon a kidnapping? Was this some kind of torture chamber? Was the person who had done this still around somewhere? The thought that the captor might return at any moment filled her with terror. But looking at the man chained in the corner, she knew she couldn't just leave him there to die. She took a step closer, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. The sound caused the man to lift his head slightly. Their eyes met in the beam of the flashlight, and Sarah saw a mixture of fear, hope, and desperation in his gaze. His lips moved as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. He was clearly in very bad shape, probably suffering from dehydration, starvation, and exposure to the cold. Sarah's first instinct was to run back to her car and try to drive to the nearest town to get help. But the storm was still raging outside, her car was stuck, and she had no way to communicate with anyone. Even if she could somehow get her car unstuck, she might not be able to find this place again in the whiteout conditions. The man might die before she could return with help. She realized that she was probably his only hope for survival. Whatever had happened to him, whoever had done this to him, none of that mattered right now. He was a human being in desperate need of help, and she was the only one who could provide it. The storm that had put her in danger had also put her in a position to save someone's life. Taking a deep breath, Sarah called out softly to the man. Her voice echoed in the small space, barely audible over the wind outside. She told him that she was there to help, that she wasn't going to hurt him. She could see the relief in his eyes as he realized that someone had finally found him, someone who might be able to help him escape from this nightmare. But as Sarah looked at the heavy chains that bound him to the wall, she realized that freeing him wasn't going to be easy. The chains looked new and strong, and the locks that secured them appeared to be high quality. Whoever had imprisoned this man had taken great care to make sure he couldn't escape. She would need tools, and she would need time. Most importantly, she would need to figure out how to help him without alerting his captor to her presence. The wind continued to howl outside the shack, reminding Sarah that she was trapped there, just as surely as the man in chains. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even if it did, she had no idea how long it would take for the roads to be cleared. She might be stuck in this place for hours or even days, alone with a man who had obviously been the victim of a terrible crime. As she stood there in the flickering light of her flashlight, Sarah realized that her simple trip to visit her aunt had turned into something much more complicated and dangerous. She had become an unwitting participant in what appeared to be a kidnapping or worse. But she also knew that she couldn't turn away from someone who needed her help so desperately. Whatever happened next, she was committed to doing everything in her power to save this man's life. The question was whether she would be able to free him before whoever had chained him there came back. And if that person did return, Sarah wondered if she would become the next victim in what was clearly a very dangerous and twisted situation. The storm outside might be the least of her worries. Sarah forced herself to move closer to the chained man, fighting every instinct that told her to run. The floorboards groaned under her feet with each careful step, and she winced at every sound, afraid it might alert someone to her presence. As she approached, the full extent of the man's condition became horrifyingly clear in the beam of her flashlight. His name, she would later learn, was Dakota Running Bear, a 28-year-old member of the 3 affiliated tribes who lived on the Fort Berthold Reservation about 60 miles away. But in that moment, all Sarah could see was a human being who had been subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The chains around his wrists and ankles had cut deep wounds into his skin from his attempts to escape. The dark stains on his clothes were definitely blood, some fresh and some that had dried days ago. Dakota's face was gaunt from malnutrition, his cheekbones protruding sharply under skin that had a greyish pallor. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and his dark eyes were sunken deep into their sockets. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely a whisper, his throat too dry and damaged to produce normal sound. Sarah had to lean close to hear what he was trying to tell her. "Water?" he managed to croak, the single word taking enormous effort. "Please, water." Sarah immediately reached into her emergency kit and pulled out her bottle of water. She unscrewed the cap and held it to Dakota's lips, allowing him to take small sips. She had to be careful not to let him drink too much too quickly, knowing that someone in his condition could become sick if they consumed too much water at once. Dakota's hands shook as he tried to help guide the bottle, the chains clanking against the wall with every movement. As he drank, Sarah noticed other details that painted a picture of prolonged captivity and abuse. There were what looked like burn marks on his arms, possibly from cigarettes. His clothes were torn in places that suggested he had been beaten. Most disturbing of all, there were injection marks on his arms indicating that he had been forcibly drugged to keep him compliant. "Who did this to you?" Sarah asked quietly, though she wasn't sure Dakota was strong enough to answer. "How long have you been here?" Dakota closed his eyes and took several shallow breaths before responding. "Don't know how long," he whispered. "Weeks. Maybe more. 3 men. Took me from the casino parking lot." He paused, struggling to continue. They said I saw something I wasn't supposed to see." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized this wasn't just a random kidnapping. Dakota had been targeted for a specific reason, and that meant the people who had taken him were probably very dangerous. They had gone to great lengths to keep him hidden and alive, which suggested they might still have use for him. The thought that they could return at any moment made her hands shake as she continued to give Dakota water. "We need to get you out of here," Sarah said, though she had no idea how that would be possible. "Can you tell me anything about the men who did this? What they looked like? What kind of car they drove?" Dakota's eyes focused on her with surprising intensity despite his weakened state. The leader, tall white man, scar on his left cheek, drives a black pickup truck. He took another sip of water before continuing. "They work for someone important. They kept talking about keeping me quiet until after some kind of deal." Sarah examined the chains more closely, hoping to find some weakness she could exploit. The metal links were thick and appeared to be made of hardened steel. The locks were modern and sophisticated, definitely not something she could break with the tools in her emergency kit. The metal rings that anchored the chains to the wall had been bolted through the wooden planks into what felt like concrete blocks behind them. Whoever had set this up had planned it carefully. "They check on me every few days," Dakota continued weakly. "Bring food, drugs to keep me quiet. Last time was yesterday, maybe day before. Hard to tell." His voice trailed off as exhaustion overtook him. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do. If the captors checked on Dakota every few days and their last visit was recent, that meant they might not return for a while. But it also meant they would definitely be back, and if they found her there, she would likely become another victim. She needed to find a way to free Dakota quickly, or at least get word to the authorities about what was happening. She turned her attention to the lock mechanisms, hoping to find some way to pick or disable them. Sarah had no experience with lock picking, but she had watched enough movies to know that sometimes simpler locks could be manipulated with the right tools. Unfortunately, these locks appeared to be anything but simple. They were modern, high-security padlocks, the kind used by professionals who wanted to make sure their prisoners couldn't escape. The shack itself offered few resources. Sarah searched through the old farming equipment and tools scattered around the space, looking for anything that might help. Most of the items were rusty and corroded from years of exposure to moisture and cold. She found an old hacksaw with a dull blade, some rusty pliers, and various other hand tools, but nothing that looked like it could cut through hardened steel chains. As she searched, Dakota watched her with a mixture of hope and desperation. "You shouldn't be here," he said weakly. "If they come back, they'll kill you too." Despite his own dire situation, he seemed more concerned about Sarah's safety than his own. "I'm not leaving you here," Sarah replied firmly. "There has to be a way to get you free." She continued to examine the chains and locks, looking for any weakness or flaw she might have missed. That's when she noticed something interesting about one of the bolts holding the metal rings to the wall. Unlike the others, which appeared to be firmly secured, this one seemed to have some play in it. The wood around it was slightly rotted from moisture that had leaked through the walls over the years. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to work with. Sarah found a crowbar among the old tools and began carefully working at the loose bolt. The metal ring was attached with 4 bolts, and if she could remove even one of them, it might create enough slack in the chain to allow Dakota to slip his hand through the manacle. It was a long shot, but it was better than doing nothing. As she worked, Dakota told her more about his captivity. He had been working as a security guard at the Prairie Knights Casino on the reservation when he witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. A meeting between several men in expensive suits and what appeared to be local law enforcement officers. Money had changed hands, along with what looked like documents. Dakota had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone had noticed him watching. "I didn't think much of it at first," Dakota explained, as Sarah continued to work on the bolt. "Thought maybe it was just some kind of business deal. But then they started asking questions about me. My supervisor told me to keep quiet about what I saw, said it was nothing to worry about." 3 days later, Dakota had been grabbed in the casino parking lot as he was leaving work. The abduction had been quick and professional. A van had pulled up beside his car, and 3 men had forced him inside at gunpoint. They had driven for hours, eventually arriving at this isolated shack where they had chained him up and left him to rot. "They kept asking me who I told," Dakota continued. "Who else saw the meeting? I kept telling them nobody, that I hadn't said anything to anyone, but they didn't believe me." His voice was getting stronger as the water began to rehydrate his system, but he was still obviously very weak. The bolt Sarah was working on finally began to loosen. Years of moisture and temperature changes had weakened the wood around it, and the metal was corroded enough that it couldn't maintain a tight grip. She worked carefully, trying not to make too much noise, aware that sound could travel far in the stillness of the storm. As she worked, Sarah became increasingly aware of the danger she was in. If Dakota was telling the truth, and the people who had kidnapped him were involved in some kind of corruption involving law enforcement, then going to the police might not be safe. She would need to be very careful about who she trusted and how she handled the situation once she got Dakota free. The wind continued to howl outside the shack, and Sarah could hear snow pelting against the walls. The storm showed no signs of letting up, which was both good and bad. Good because it meant Dakota's captors were unlikely to venture out in such dangerous weather. Bad because it meant she and Dakota were trapped there together, unable to escape even if she did manage to free him from his chains. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah finally managed to work the bolt completely free. The metal ring tilted at an angle, creating just enough slack in the chain for Dakota to potentially slip his hand through the manacle around his wrist. But his hands were badly swollen from the tight restraints and poor circulation, making it difficult for him to take advantage of the opening she had created. Sarah helped him work his hand through the loosened manacle, being as gentle as possible, to avoid causing more damage to his already injured wrist. It was slow, painful work, and several times Dakota had to stop and rest from the exertion. But eventually, his left hand came free from the chain. With one hand free, Dakota was able to help Sarah work on the other restraints. His knowledge of the shack and his captors proved invaluable. He knew which floorboards creaked the most, where his captors usually parked their vehicle, and what time of day they typically arrived for their visits. This information would be crucial if they were going to plan an escape without being caught. But as Dakota flexed his newly freed hand and tried to restore circulation to his arm, Both he and Sarah realized that their ordeal was far from over. Getting him completely free from the chains was only the first step. They still had to figure out how to get out of the shack, how to travel in the blizzard conditions, and, most importantly, how to get help without alerting the corrupt officials who might be involved in Dakota's kidnapping. The storm outside continued to rage, and Sarah began to understand that they might be trapped in the shack together for quite some time. She would need to keep Dakota alive and healthy while figuring out their next move. And all the while, she would have to live with the knowledge that 3 dangerous men could return at any moment to check on their prisoner. With Dakota's left hand free, the work of removing the remaining restraints went faster, though it was still painstakingly slow and dangerous. Sarah had to be careful not to injure Dakota further as she worked to free his other wrist and both ankles from the heavy chains. The manacles had cut deep wounds that were infected and seeping, requiring careful attention to prevent further damage. As they worked together, Dakota shared more details about what he had witnessed at the casino that had led to his kidnapping. The meeting he had observed involved a man he later learned was a state senator, 2 FBI agents, and several local law enforcement officials from different counties. They had been discussing something called Operation Clearwater, which apparently involved covering up toxic waste dumping on tribal lands. The casino has security cameras everywhere, Dakota explained as Sarah worked on the chain around his right ankle. But that night, the cameras in the back parking lot were mysteriously turned off. That should have been my first clue that something was wrong. His voice was getting stronger as circulation returned to his limbs, but he still moved very slowly and carefully. The toxic waste disposal operation, according to what Dakota had overheard, was being run by a company with ties to organized crime. They were paying bribes to officials at multiple levels of government to look the other way while they illegally dumped chemical waste on remote parts of the reservation. The profits were enormous, and the bribes were substantial enough to corrupt people who should have been protecting the tribal lands. My grandfather's burial ground is out there, Dakota said quietly, his voice filled with pain that went beyond his physical injuries. My ancestors are buried in land that's being poisoned by these criminals, and the people who are supposed to protect us are being paid to help them do it. Sarah finally managed to free Dakota's ankle, and he was able to move around the shack for the first time in weeks. His legs were weak and unsteady, but the relief of being able to stand and stretch was obvious. He moved slowly around the small space, trying to work, feeling back into his limbs while staying alert for any sounds that might indicate his captors were returning. The shack offered few comforts, but Sarah and Dakota worked together to make their situation more bearable. They found some old tarps and horse blankets that they could use for warmth and to block some of the cold air that leaked through the gaps in the walls. Sarah shared her emergency food supplies with Dakota, though she was careful to give him small amounts at first to avoid making him sick. As they huddled together for warmth, Dakota told Sarah more about his life and background. He was a veteran who had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger. After leaving the military, he had returned to the reservation to be close to his elderly grandmother and to work for his tribe. The security job at the casino was supposed to be peaceful work, a chance to serve his community without the dangers he had faced overseas. I thought I was done with this kind of danger, Dakota said with bitter irony. I served my country, came home to help my people, and ended up chained in a shack by corrupt officials who are supposed to protect us. The betrayal by people in positions of authority had obviously affected him deeply. Sarah learned that Dakota had been trying to gather evidence about the illegal waste dumping even before the meeting he witnessed. Several members of his tribe had been getting sick with unusual illnesses, and the tribal council suspected their land was being contaminated. Dakota had been using his position at the casino to watch for suspicious activity and had been planning to contact federal authorities about what he was discovering. The FBI agents at that meeting, Dakota continued, I think they were there to make sure the investigation got buried. They weren't there to stop the corruption, they were part of it. This revelation made Sarah realize that they couldn't simply call federal law enforcement for help. They would need to be very careful about who they trusted with the information they had. As the hours passed, the storm outside began to show signs of weakening slightly. The wind was still strong, but the snow wasn't falling as heavily as before. Sarah periodically checked on her car through a crack in the wall and saw that it was almost completely buried in snowdrifts. Even if the storm stopped completely, it would be a long time before the roads were passable again. Dakota used the time to tell Sarah everything he could remember about the men who had kidnapped him and the operation they were covering up. The leader, the tall man with the scar on his cheek, was apparently a private contractor named Marcus Sullivan who worked for various government agencies doing jobs that required plausible deniability. Sullivan had a reputation for making problems disappear permanently. He told me I would never leave this place alive, Dakota said matter-of-factly. Said the only question was whether it would be quick or slow, depending on how cooperative I was about forgetting what I saw. Despite his matter-of-fact tone, Sarah could see the fear in Dakota's eyes when he talked about Sullivan. The other two men were Sullivan's regular associates, both ex-military like Dakota, but with very different moral compasses. One was a demolitions expert named Crane who apparently enjoyed inflicting pain. The other was a former sniper called Torres, who served as the team's scout and surveillance specialist. Together, they formed a crew that specialized in intimidation, kidnapping, and when necessary, elimination of problems. Sarah began to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping or even a straightforward corruption case. Dakota had stumbled onto a major criminal conspiracy that involved toxic waste, government corruption, and professional killers. The people behind it had enough money and influence to buy off FBI agents and state senators. They would not hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. "We need evidence," Sarah said as she thought through their options. "Even if we get out of here, who's going to believe us without proof? And how do we know who we can trust in law enforcement?" Dakota had been thinking about the same problem. "There's a reporter in Bismarck named Jennifer Walsh who's been investigating corruption on the reservation for years. She's one of the few people I trust to handle this story properly." He gave Sarah contact information for Walsh, making her memorize the phone number in case something happened to him. As they planned their next moves, Dakota also told Sarah about hidden evidence he had managed to gather before his kidnapping. He had been secretly photographing suspicious vehicles and license plates at the casino, and he had managed to record part of a conversation between two of the conspirators using his phone. All of this evidence was hidden in his apartment on the reservation. "If we can get to my place, I can give you everything I collected," Dakota explained. "Pictures, recordings, documents I copied from the casino's files. It's enough to start a real investigation, if we can get it to the right people." But getting to Dakota's apartment would require escaping from the shack, traveling 60 miles across dangerous winter conditions, and doing it all without being detected by Sullivan and his team. Sarah's car was buried and probably wouldn't start anyway after sitting in the cold for so long. They would need another plan. That's when Dakota remembered something that gave them both hope. About a quarter mile from the shack, there was an old farmhouse that belonged to his cousin Robert. The house had been abandoned for years after Robert moved to Minneapolis for work, but Robert had always kept an old pickup truck stored in the barn there in case he ever needed to come back to check on the property. The truck might not run, Dakota admitted, but Robert always kept it maintained pretty well. "If we can get there without being seen, and if we can get the truck started, we might have a way out." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than being trapped in the shack waiting for Sullivan and his men to return. As they discussed the plan, both Sarah and Dakota were acutely aware that they were taking enormous risks. If they were caught trying to escape, Sullivan would almost certainly kill them both. But staying in the shack wasn't safe either. Eventually, Dakota's captors would return, and when they found him free from his chains, they would know someone had helped him. "You could leave without me," Dakota suggested quietly. "Take the information I've given you and go to the reporter. You don't have to risk your life for someone you just met." Sarah looked at him with determination. "I'm not leaving you here," she said firmly. "We're getting out of this together, or not at all." Outside, the storm was definitely weakening. The wind had dropped to a steady howl rather than the screaming gale it had been earlier. Snow was still falling, but not with the blinding intensity of before. If they were going to make a break for the abandoned farmhouse, soon might be their best opportunity. But as they prepared to leave the shack, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times during the evening, she had thought she heard sounds outside that didn't match the pattern of wind and storm. It could have been her imagination, or it could have been Sullivan and his men checking on their prisoner despite the dangerous weather. Dakota had noticed the same thing. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts about danger, and those instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. "We need to be very careful," he warned Sarah. "These men are professionals. They might have surveillance equipment set up around this place." As they gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to venture back out into the blizzard, both Sarah and Dakota knew they were embarking on the most dangerous part of their ordeal. The storm had been their protection, keeping Sullivan's team away from the shack. But now that same storm would be their enemy as they tried to escape across a quarter mile of open ground in sub-zero temperatures and whiteout conditions. Their survival would depend on reaching the abandoned farmhouse without being detected, finding a working vehicle, and then driving 60 miles across treacherous roads while avoiding capture by professional killers who had every advantage except the element of surprise. It seemed almost impossible, but it was their only chance at survival, and their only hope of exposing the corruption that had cost so many lives already. Sarah and Dakota waited until the early hours of the morning before attempting their escape. The storm had weakened considerably, though snow was still falling and the wind remained dangerous. More importantly, Dakota calculated that this was the time when Sullivan and his men were least likely to be checking on their prisoner. They had established a pattern of visiting every 2 to 3 days, usually in the afternoon. Before leaving the shack, they did their best to make it appear that Dakota was still chained to the wall. Using the old tarps and some debris, they created a crude dummy that might fool someone making a quick check from the doorway. It wouldn't withstand close inspection, but it might buy them precious time if the captors returned sooner than expected. Dakota's physical condition was still very poor after weeks of captivity and abuse. His legs were weak and unsteady, and he moved slowly despite his determination to escape. Sarah worried that he wouldn't be able to make the quarter-mile trek through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures. But Dakota was driven by something deeper than physical strength. The thought of exposing the people who had poisoned his ancestral lands gave him energy that his battered body shouldn't have been able to provide. They left the shack just before dawn, when the grey winter light was beginning to filter through the clouds, but visibility was still very limited. Sarah went first, breaking trail through the knee-deep snow, while Dakota followed in her footsteps to conserve his energy. The cold was brutal, worse than anything Sarah had ever experienced. Within minutes, her face was numb and her fingers were losing feeling despite her gloves. Dakota struggled more than he wanted to admit. His body had been weakened by weeks of poor nutrition and medical neglect, and the infected wounds on his wrists and ankles burned with every step. But he pushed forward, knowing that stopping meant death for both of them. His military training helped him manage the pain and keep moving despite his body's protests. The landscape around them was completely white and featureless. Sarah had been counting her steps to estimate distance, but in the swirling snow and grey dawn light, it was impossible to maintain a sense of direction. They could easily become lost and freeze to death just yards from shelter. Dakota took the lead as they got farther from the shack, using his knowledge of the area to navigate by subtle landmarks that were invisible to Sarah. Halfway to their destination, they had to stop and take shelter behind a small grove of trees when they heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Dakota's expression turned grim as he recognized the deep rumble of a large pickup truck. Sullivan and his men were apparently willing to brave the storm conditions to check on their prisoner. "They're early," Dakota whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Something must have spooked them. They huddled together behind the largest tree, trying to stay hidden while the truck slowly approached the shack. Through the falling snow, Sarah could just make out the dark shape of a vehicle stopping near the building they had just left. 3 figures got out and approached the shack with obvious caution. Even from a distance, their professional movements made it clear these were dangerous men who knew what they were doing. The sound of shouting carried across the snowy landscape as Sullivan and his men discovered that Dakota was gone. Sarah and Dakota could hear angry voices, though they couldn't make out specific words. The men spent several minutes inside the shack, probably examining the chains and trying to figure out how their prisoner had escaped. "They'll start searching immediately," Dakota warned quietly. "These guys are trackers. The snow will make our trail easy to follow until the wind covers it up." Sure enough, within minutes the 3 men emerged from the shack and began following the footprints Sarah and Dakota had left in the snow. The escapees had perhaps a 10-minute head start, but their pursuers were healthy and well-equipped while Dakota could barely walk. It would be a race they were unlikely to win through speed alone. Dakota made a quick decision that probably saved both their lives. Instead of continuing directly toward his cousin's farmhouse, he led Sarah on a detour that took them through a frozen creek bed. The ice was thick enough to support their weight, and walking on it for several hundred yards would break their trail and confuse their pursuers. The detour cost them precious time and energy, but it worked. When Sullivan and his men reached the point where the footprints entered the creek, they were forced to split up and search both directions along the frozen waterway. This bought Sarah and Dakota the time they needed to reach the abandoned farmhouse without being spotted. Robert's old farmhouse was in even worse condition than the shack they had escaped from. The roof had partially collapsed and most of the windows were broken. But the barn behind the house was still structurally sound, and when they forced open the large doors, they found exactly what Dakota had hoped for. His cousin's old pickup truck was there, covered by a canvas tarp and surrounded by farming equipment. Dakota pulled off the tarp to reveal a rust-covered but potentially functional Ford pickup that looked like it was from the early 90s. The truck had clearly been sitting unused for years, but Robert had taken care of it before abandoning the farm. The battery was dead, but there were jumper cables in the bed of the truck and an old portable battery charger plugged into an outlet that still had power. While Dakota worked on getting the truck running, Sarah kept watch for their pursuers. The barn had several windows that gave views in different directions, allowing her to monitor the approaches to the farmhouse. The snow was still falling heavily enough to provide some concealment, but she knew it wouldn't hide them indefinitely. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Dakota managed to get the truck's engine to turn over. It ran roughly and loudly, but it ran. The gas tank showed a quarter full, which might be enough to reach the reservation if they were careful. More importantly, the heater worked, providing blessed warmth for the first time since their ordeal had begun. But their escape was far from over. The truck had been sitting unused for so long that its mechanical condition was questionable. The tires were old and not well suited for winter driving. The transmission made concerning noises when Dakota shifted gears, and most critically, they would have to drive past the shack where Sullivan and his men were based in order to reach the main road. Dakota decided their best chance was to take a longer route that avoided the main roads altogether. He knew back roads and farm tracks that might be passable with four-wheel drive, even in the storm conditions. It would take longer and use more fuel, but it would reduce their chances of encountering their pursuers. As they prepared to leave the barn, Sarah spotted movement near the shack in the distance. The three men had apparently given up their search of the creek bed and returned to their vehicle. But instead of leaving the area, they were setting up what looked like a surveillance position. Sullivan was clearly planning to wait for Dakota and Sarah to make a move. "They know we can't have gone far in this weather," Dakota explained, as he watched the distant figures through the barn's window. "They're going to wait for us to come to them, or for the storm to end, so they can track us properly." This created a serious problem. Sarah and Dakota couldn't stay in the barn indefinitely, but leaving would expose them to being spotted by their pursuers. The truck was loud and would be easily heard from a considerable distance in the quiet of the storm. Once they started driving, Sullivan and his men would know exactly where they were. Dakota came up with a plan that was risky but might work. They would wait until Sullivan's team seemed settled in for a long surveillance session, then start the truck and drive away as quickly as possible. The storm would limit visibility, and if they could get enough of a head start, they might be able to lose their pursuers on the back roads. They waited until mid-morning, when they could see smoke rising from a small fire Sullivan's men had built near their truck. The men appeared to be hunkered down for an extended wait, confident that their quarry couldn't escape the area without being detected. This was the opportunity Dakota and Sarah had been waiting for. Dakota started the truck and immediately put it in gear, driving as fast as he dared on the snow-covered farm track that led away from the barn. The old Ford slipped and slid on the icy surface, but its four-wheel drive system kept them moving forward. Behind them, they could hear shouting as Sullivan's men realized their prisoners were escaping. The chase that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Dakota drove the old pickup truck at dangerous speeds over roads that were barely passable, taking turns that threw both of them against the doors and windows. Behind them, Sullivan's modern truck was faster and better equipped, but Dakota's knowledge of the local roads gave them a crucial advantage. Several times, Dakota took turns onto tracks that looked impassable, only to have them open up into usable routes that his cousin had showed him years earlier. Sullivan's team was forced to follow more slowly, unsure of whether they were being led into dead ends or traps. This caution cost them precious time and allowed the old Ford to maintain its lead. But the truck's mechanical problems were getting worse. The transmission was making increasingly loud grinding noises, and the engine was running roughly. Dakota worried that they would break down before reaching safety, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere, with professional killers closing in behind them. As they drove through the storm, Dakota told Sarah more about what they would need to do once they reached the reservation. His evidence was hidden in his apartment, but they couldn't simply walk in and retrieve it. Sullivan's people might already be watching the place, and even if they weren't, word of Dakota's escape would spread quickly once Sullivan reported it to his employers. "My grandmother lives about 2 miles from my place," Dakota explained as he fought to keep the truck on the icy road. "She's got a phone and she's not afraid of anyone. If we can get to her house, she can contact people we trust and help us figure out who we can safely give the evidence to." Sarah noticed that Dakota's driving was becoming increasingly erratic as exhaustion and pain took their toll. The adrenaline that had sustained him through their escape was wearing off, and his injuries were making it difficult for him to maintain focus. She offered to take over the driving, but Dakota insisted that his knowledge of the roads was too important to give up. Behind them, the sound of Sullivan's truck was getting louder. The modern vehicle was gradually gaining ground on the old Ford, and Dakota knew they wouldn't be able to outrun their pursuers much longer. He would have to try something desperate if they were going to have any chance of reaching his grandmother's house alive. As they approached a section of road that crossed a frozen marsh, Dakota made a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Instead of staying on the main track, he turned onto what looked like solid ground, but was actually a frozen swamp. The gamble was enormous. If the ice held, they might be able to take a shortcut that would put them ahead of their pursuers. If the ice broke, they would die in the freezing water. The truck moved slowly across the frozen marsh, its weight causing the ice to crack and groan beneath them. Several times, Sarah was sure they were about to break through, but somehow the ice held. Behind them, Sullivan's heavier truck was forced to stay on the main road, unwilling to risk the dangerous shortcut. When they finally reached solid ground on the other side of the marsh, Dakota and Sarah had gained perhaps 15 minutes on their pursuers. It might be enough time to reach his grandmother's house and call for help if the truck held together and if the old woman was home. But their ordeal was far from over, and both of them knew that Sullivan would not give up easily. The old pickup truck finally gave out just half a mile from Dakota's grandmother's house. The transmission made a grinding noise that sounded like metal tearing apart, and then the truck simply stopped moving forward despite Dakota's attempts to keep it running. Smoke began pouring from under the hood, and they knew their mechanical transportation had reached its end. Dakota's grandmother, Agnes Running Bear, was 83 years old and had lived on the reservation her entire life. She had raised Dakota after his parents died in a car accident when he was 14, and she was one of the few people he trusted completely. Her small house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by pine trees that provided natural concealment from the road. Sarah and Dakota abandoned the smoking truck and ran through knee-deep snow toward the house. Dakota's legs were shaking from exhaustion and pain, and Sarah had to help support him during the final stretch. Behind them in the distance, they could hear the sound of Sullivan's truck growing louder as their pursuers followed the road they had taken. Agnes Running Bear opened her door before they even knocked, having heard the commotion of their arrival. She was a small woman with silver hair braided down her back and dark eyes that missed nothing. One look at her grandson's condition told her everything she needed to know about the danger they were in. "Inside, quickly!" she said, ushering them into her warm kitchen. "You look like hell, grandson." She immediately began heating water for tea and gathering medical supplies to treat Dakota's infected wounds. Despite being in her 80s, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with crisis situations before. While Agnes cleaned and bandaged Dakota's injuries, he quickly explained what had happened and what they needed to do. His grandmother listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as she learned about the corruption and violence that had nearly cost Dakota his life. When he finished his story, she was quiet for a long moment. "I've been expecting something like this," Agnes said finally. "Too many of our young people have been getting sick, too many strange trucks coming and going in the night. The spirits of our ancestors have been restless." She moved to an old rotary phone on her kitchen counter and began making calls. The first call was to Jennifer Walsh, the investigative reporter in Bismarck that Dakota had mentioned. Agnes explained the situation briefly and gave Walsh Dakota's location, asking her to come immediately and to bring a camera crew. The second call was to Tribal Police Chief Robert Crow Feather, who Agnes trusted to handle the situation properly despite the potential for corruption in other law enforcement agencies. "Robert will be here in 20 minutes, Agnes told them. "Jennifer said she can be here in 2 hours, but we need to get you to a safe place before those men figure out where you are." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see the black pickup truck that had been chasing them, slowly coming up the gravel driveway. Sullivan had apparently spotted their abandoned truck and followed their tracks through the snow. Agnes Running Bear proved that age had not diminished her courage or quick thinking. She immediately sent Dakota and Sarah to hide in a concealed basement room that had been built during the Cold War era, when many reservation families had prepared for the possibility of nuclear attack. The hidden room was accessible through a trapdoor in her bedroom floor, concealed under an old rug. When Sullivan and his 2 associates knocked on Agnes's door, she answered it calmly and invited them inside for coffee. The 3 men were armed and dangerous, but they were also trying to maintain a pretense of legitimacy. They couldn't simply murder an elderly Native American woman in her own home without creating major problems for their operation. From the hidden basement room, Sarah and Dakota could hear the conversation upstairs through heating vents. Sullivan was polite but threatening as he questioned Agnes about whether she had seen her grandson or anyone else who might be hiding on her property. Agnes played the role of a confused elderly woman perfectly, claiming she hadn't seen Dakota in weeks and expressing concern about what kind of trouble he might be in. "We're with the federal government," Sullivan explained, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate cooperation. Your grandson has information related to a national security investigation. We need to speak with him urgently. Agnes pretended to be impressed by their authority, while actually gathering intelligence about their operation. She asked seemingly innocent questions about which federal agency they represented and how they had tracked Dakota to the area. Their answers revealed inconsistencies that confirmed Dakota's story about corruption at multiple levels of law enforcement. The confrontation upstairs became more tense when Sullivan began to lose patience with Agnes's apparent helplessness. He and his men began searching the house without permission, looking for signs that Dakota and Sarah had been there recently. They found wet clothes hanging by the wood stove and noticed that someone had recently used the first aid supplies. Running bear, Sullivan said with barely controlled menace. I think you're not being entirely honest with us. We know your grandson was here recently. Where is he now? Agnes maintained her facade of confusion even as the three armed men became more aggressive in their search. She claimed the wet clothes belonged to a neighbor who had stopped by after getting caught in the storm. The medical supplies, she said, were for treating a cut on her hand from preparing vegetables. Her performance was convincing enough to create doubt in Sullivan's mind about whether Dakota had actually been there. In the basement, Dakota was growing increasingly concerned about his grandmother's safety. He wanted to surrender himself to protect her, but Sarah convinced him to wait a little longer. Tribal Police Chief Crowfeather should arrive soon, and Agnes seemed to be handling the situation skillfully. Revealing themselves now would only put Agnes in more danger. The standoff upstairs was resolved when they heard the sound of another vehicle approaching the house. Sullivan and his men immediately became alert, positioning themselves to see who was arriving. When tribal police vehicles pulled into the driveway, Sullivan made a quick decision to withdraw, rather than risk a confrontation with local law enforcement. We'll be back, Sullivan told Agnes as he and his men prepared to leave. This matter isn't over. Your grandson is in serious trouble, and anyone who helps him will face consequences. Agnes watched calmly as the three men left her house and drove away. She waited until their vehicle was completely out of sight before calling down to Dakota and Sarah that it was safe to come up from the basement. When they emerged, they found Agnes preparing more food and medical supplies, as if harboring fugitives from federal agents was something she dealt with regularly. Chief Crowfeather arrived 15 minutes later with 2 deputies and a medical technician. Dakota trusted the chief completely, having known him since childhood. Crowfeather had a reputation for integrity and had been fighting against corruption on the reservation for years. He was also politically savvy enough to handle a situation that involved federal law enforcement and organized crime. After examining Dakota's injuries and hearing his story, Chief Crowfeather immediately called the FBI field office in Minneapolis and requested a meeting with agents who were not involved in the local corruption. He also contacted the Tribal Council and several civil rights organizations that had been investigating environmental crimes against Native American communities. When Jennifer Walsh arrived with her camera crew, Dakota was finally able to tell his full story to someone with the resources and connections to expose the conspiracy. Walsh had been investigating similar cases of environmental crime and government corruption for several years, and Dakota's evidence filled in crucial gaps in her ongoing investigation. The evidence Dakota had hidden in his apartment was retrieved under the protection of tribal police and federal agents from outside the region. The photographs, recordings, and documents he had gathered provided concrete proof of the toxic waste dumping operation and the bribes that had enabled it. Combined with his eyewitness testimony about the meeting at the casino, it was enough to launch a major federal investigation. Sullivan and his associates were arrested 3 days later as they attempted to leave the state. The FBI raid on their operation uncovered additional evidence of their crimes, including detailed records of bribes paid to various officials and plans for eliminating witnesses who threatened their operation. Sullivan was eventually convicted on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy, and violating federal environmental laws. The investigation that followed Dakota's rescue exposed a massive criminal conspiracy that had been operating for more than 5 years. 17 people were eventually convicted, including the state senator Dakota had seen at the casino.
2 FBI agents, 4 local law enforcement officials, and several executives from the waste disposal company.
The tribal lands that had been contaminated were cleaned up at the company's expense, and significant financial settlements were paid to affected community members. Sarah's role in Dakota's rescue made her a key witness in the federal prosecution, but it also created lasting bonds between her and the Running Bear family. Agnes insisted that Sarah was now part of their family, having risked her life to save Dakota when no one else knew he was in danger. Sarah returned to visit the reservation several times over the following years, maintaining friendships that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. For Dakota, The experience was transformative in ways that went beyond simply surviving a kidnapping. His evidence and testimony helped convict the people who had been poisoning his ancestral lands, fulfilling a responsibility he felt toward his ancestors and future generations. The physical and emotional scars from his captivity healed slowly, but his sense of purpose in protecting his community had been strengthened. The toxic waste site was completely remediated, and new federal protections were put in place to prevent similar crimes against tribal lands. Dakota used his experience to become an advocate for environmental protection and government accountability, working with tribal councils across the region to identify and prevent corruption. Agnes Running Bear lived to see all of the criminals involved in her grandson's kidnapping brought to justice. She died peacefully at age 87, surrounded by family including Sarah, whom she had formally adopted into the tribe in recognition of her courage and loyalty. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her wisdom and strength. The blizzard that had trapped Sarah in the shack where Dakota was being held was later determined to be one of the worst winter storms in North Dakota history. But for Sarah and Dakota, the storm had been a blessing in disguise. Without it, Sarah never would have found Dakota, and he would have died in chains in that abandoned shack. The storm that had threatened to kill them had actually saved their lives and exposed a criminal conspiracy that had threatened an entire community. Years later, Sarah often reflected on how a simple trip to visit her aunt had changed the course of multiple lives. Her decision to seek shelter in that abandoned shack had set in motion a chain of events that brought justice to Dakota's people and safety to their lands. Sometimes, she realized, the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary circumstances that happen to intersect in extraordinary ways. The story of Dakota's rescue became part of tribal oral history, told and retold as an example of how courage and determination could overcome even the most powerful forms of corruption. For the Running Bear family and the entire reservation community, it was a reminder that justice was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources during the darkest storms.